Today we will have a packed webinar presentation, and I think many of you have already participated in many similar webinars, so I hope we'll have something in addition to that content. So today I'm joined by my colleagues, Steve, George, Pietro Di Tondo, on this webinar as the subject matter experts. I will retain my moderator role in this webinar. So less of me this time, though, maybe good, as good. So Steve, do you want to introduce yourself just to the public, please?
Yes, I'm ex-aerospace industry, 33 years in industry. I was chair of the ASD REACH Chemicals Working Group for many years ago, and I'm now senior advisor with REACH Law.
Thank you, Steve. Pietro, please.
Hello, everyone. Yes, my name is Pietro Di Tondo, as Paddy said, director of the UK team, part of the REACH Law family, based here in Manchester. Background is chemistry. I worked previously to join REACH Law in the industry, in the corporate environment, specifically on polymers. So hence my participation to this webinar.
Thank you, Pietro. And I'm Fredrik Johansson, partner, head of sales at REACH Law. Also chemical background and a long background in chemical regulations. So that will be, and these are the presenters for today. And just some practical information for the webinar. So you will be able to send questions using the chat function. I see that we've already received some questions, and we got quite a lot of questions ahead of this webinar. So we'll try to go through all of those as best we can, of course, during the Q&A session. And if we will not have time to go through all of these, we'll try to, of course, get back to you by email afterwards. We'll make a recording of this webinar, which will be available to you through a link that will be shared, and later on also on our YouTube channel called REACH Law Talks. And please provide feedback. We always appreciate that. We want to, of course, learn and become better. So all kind of feedback is welcome. Thank you. So we have a packed agenda for today, and I suspect that 60 minutes is optimistic. So if we go a bit over that, please do bear with us. Or then, of course, if you have to leave, you can watch the recording. So as before we start with just a brief introduction to REACH Law, they will look at what are PFAS. Then we look at the PFAS restriction proposal, give an overview thereof, and then also how you should prepare and what to expect thereof. Look at some long-term implications before then concluding and heading over to the Q&A session at the end. So REACH Law, who are we? So we provide chemical regulatory compliance services for REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations. So this nowadays, of course, also includes the UK REACH regulation, but also the Turkey KKD-IK regulation, where we have a lot of activity at the moment, but also then the K-REACH regulation, and later on, maybe whenever the India REACH regulation enters into force. And of course, then the EU REACH regulation, which will be the focal point of this presentation. So we provide support, or essentially all kinds of support related to these chemical regulations, from the basic only representation services to registering substances, to going and preparing the lead dossiers and submitting authorizations, etc. So the full suite, if you will, spectrum of services related to these chemical regulations. So please, if you have any questions related, please do feel free to contact us. I will not go into details here in the interest of saving a bit of time. So we really specialize in chemical regulatory compliance and sustainability. And for those of you who know, we do have our YouTube channel called REACH Law Talks, which is lagging a bit behind in posting of the latest webinars, but it will be there soon. So if you want to head over and look at our past webinars, please do so and subscribe if you like the content. So also just wanted to draw some attention to a symposium or webinar, not a webinar, I mean a conference, if you will, a symposium that we are having in Manchester in October from 25 to 26th of October. So we will have this talking about webinars all the time, this symposium together with CBA and we will focus on UK chemical regulations, EU, and also where we are going with these chemical regulations in the future, as well as then certain global chemical regulations, such as Turkey and K-REACH and so forth, and also related sustainability aspects thereof. And we will have external speakers from the industry, from CBA, and from the authorities. So please, if you are interested in joining us live, do contact us at marketing@reachlaw.fi to take benefit of this early bird discount of 20%. It's not a huge expense anyway, but if you want to take benefit, then please write to us, and we'd like to see you there in person. Okay, but before going to the actual content of this webinar, I just wanted to remind you of the disclaimers and copyright. So any actions you may take based on the presentation here is of course under your own responsibility. So no representations, warranties are made with regards to the completeness, accuracy, and the content of this presentation. And of course, Reach Law holds all the copyright as far as permitted. That's the obligatory disclaimer and the copyright notice forced upon us, of course, by our dear lawyers. Okay, then we'll just turn off the camera feed just to conserve a bit of bandwidth. So I will hand over to Pietro to go through what are PFAS. So Pietro, please go ahead and let me know when to change slides.
No problem. Thank you for the introduction, Frederick. So yes, what are PFAS? Let's have a look on the next slides. More specifically, PFAS are the name, as is suggested, are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and more specifically, all the substance that contains at least one fluorinated methyl group or a methylene group, so CF3 or CF2 atoms within the chain. We also added into this slide the definition that the main one for Europe, which is under OECD, and is the one that will be heavily used for the restriction proposal, but also you can see a bit of a slight difference for the UK HSC definitions, but nevertheless, the same group, the same atom effectively are the same. So next slide, please. So the global focus on PFAS, there's been a heavily huge topic, increasingly gaining of interest. They even done quite lately a movie called Dark Water, which described the PFAS. So there's exposure to PFAS are in general gain and increasingly, and also there are already some restricted PFAS, because obviously there is a pollution on the environment concern, including drinking water, and also there's been restriction into plenty of other countries, especially in the US for California, Washington, and New York prop, but also in Australia, and they will soon be looking at a more wider scale worldwide. Thank you very much. Next slide. PFAS, what they're also called, first of all, PFAS are man-made, so they are synthesized, so they can't be found naturally. So they are called forever chemicals. So the scope of the restriction is to do with the fact that these substances are persistent themselves, or they are very big lifespan, so they degrade quite difficultly. So the persistence of the chemical group is due to the strength in the carbon-fluorine bonds, which occurs obviously as a PFAS on monomers. PFAS remain in the environment for decades to centuries, so they are quite very hard to degrade. So the risk and assessments, they show persistence, mobility, and bioaccumulation, which can then cause cancer, specifically liver cancer was studied, and also the other toxicity accumulation within plants, environments, water, and other food group chain. Next slide, please. So the properties are highlighted in this slide, so you can see the very high persistence and long range transport of potential, and also mobility. Accumulation in plants and the bioaccumulation that provoke some ecotoxical toxicology concern, as well as endocrine activity, which are not all the bad, but obviously these are the main property of the PFAS. Due to the property, the concern, and then highlighted with the increase in any irreversible exposure for human health, and the difficulty to decontaminate into the ambience and water. Potential other effects are not fully studied, but the main one is to do with sustainability, and in fact is the global warming potential due to the long chain of the carbon and fluorine group atoms within the chemical structure. Next slide, please. So in this figure, I just provided an overview of the human cycle, or as far as it concerns the pathway for the human exposure. So basically, the human can be exposed or ingest the PFAS throughout drinking water, contaminated drinking water, and also in contaminated seafood group, and then the inhalations of contaminated indoor air, and then contact with the other contaminated media. And then obviously you can see there's the food waste infrastructure, what it can be found in the environment, was in the industry, all the emission, and the consumer of the products where it contains PFAS. PFAS, let's not forget, are very useful for non-sticking properties in pans, so we do use them every day. Next slide, please. So the function, as I alluded in the previous slide, so the contamination used for properties, for technical viewpoints, they're using water and oil dirt repellent, durability under extreme condition, and they help with the temperature, pressure, and radiation of chemical to fight them off, and also use mainly in electrical and thermal insulation, as well as surfactant and refrigerants. Next slide, please. The sector of use are plenty. I just grouped them all in this slide just for you for reference perspective. So they go from industrial, firefighting, consumer mixers, skywax, but also main one that does give concern as cosmetic, medical device, but also food applications like a container of food. PFAS are very useful in different sectors. Obviously, the risk is what needs to be assessed. Next slide, please. As far as emissions, because they are so heavily used in all different kinds of industry, the emissions has been quite high. A study proved in 2020 the emission of PFAS was of 75,000 tons of emission, which is a quite high figure, and 4.5 million tons of the emission for over 30 years is what has been estimated throughout. Next slide, please. So now what we're going to do, we're just going to have a bit of a recap and overview of the restriction of the proposal, just for everyone can understand a bit better. So let's start with the next slide, setting the scene with the basic. So first of all, let's go back to the basic. What REACH stands for is registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. So the restriction, which I underline, is often forgotten because it's not within the main REACH shortened version, but the restriction are the main one for this webinar. So restriction, what they do, they help to protect our health and environment and identify the risk and address the risk, and where action need to be taken at a European Union level, especially for PFAS, and then globally at this stage. What they do as well, they limit or ban the manufacturer of chemical group, and they can also set specific conditions to use them in a safe way. And then what it can happen, a country can propose the restriction to the ECHA, the European Chemical Agency, for them to review. So this is the basic of the restriction. So next slide. The restriction is mainly done by the Annex 15. So there are steps to be taken. So the informational hazard and exposure a risk, it needs to be fully documented. They must have a justification of the action that will have to be taken at the EU level, and available already assessing alternative proposal in order to maintain the safety of the users. They also include the socioeconomic impact per se, because obviously taking out group from the society might have risk, and also operational drama in terms of closing even plants if need be at times. So it's very important to do a very thorough socioeconomic impact analysis, and also report will have to then highlight the restriction of the chemical and the measure to address the risk, and also make sure when it's finalized that it comes up with a committee. So it's always done by a committee. So it's not it's discussed and assessed by the European Committee. Next slide, please. This show basically the restriction, the process, how it works. So it's a phase process, which is mainly consists of 3 phases. The phase 1, highlighted in there, is a preparation and submission of the restriction proposal, which have 4 intermittent stage. Phase 2, it basically is split into 2 groups. The first one is a public consultation, and the second one is the opinion development, which is done by the Risk Assessment Committee, RAC in short, and the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, SAAC Committee in short. Phase 3 at the end is what will happen is the decision and following the follow-ups of the implementation of the restriction. Next slide, please. As far as the evaluation committee, so I already mentioned who is involved. So is the Risk Assessment Committee, the Socioeconomic Committee, and what they do, they test, they make sure, they evaluate the effectiveness of the proposal and what is targeted, what is capable, and the proportion of the task at risk. The socioeconomic then will have a benefit, so will assess what benefits the restriction might have, and also the cost involved, because to substitute a full group or a chemical group within the chemical industry might have a repercussion at different stage, from plants to factory works, you know, shifting jobs. So it's always all included. Everything has to be assessed within a restriction. Next slide, please. The opinion committee are always based as well, again, using the Risk Assessment Committee and also, again, the Socioeconomic Committee. Once everything, all the data are included, studied, there is an adoption by the 2 committees that they are published and then subsequently sent to the European Commission. Decision is taken after deliberation from the European Commission together with all the member states and the REACH committee. And obviously, what will follow a massive scrutiny by the EU Council and the European Parliament, because there are big decisions taken when the restriction takes place. Next slide, please. So, as far as an introduction, continuing on the PFAS proposal, so a key action, it was done under the chemical and strategy for sustainability was to phase out the PFAS because they are widely used in Europe, unless the use is essential. So as I said at the beginning, they are called forever chemical. These were established, identified, is something that was identified by 5 national countries on PFAS, the damage they provoke in Europe based on study, and there were Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway and Sweden. What is happened? There was a 2,000-page proposal was published on the ECHA website on the 2023, 7th of January, 7th of February. And the broadest, this has been already named the broadest restriction proposal under UK REACH and REACH in EU history, which is a big topic at the moment. So what will happen on March 22, ECHA given a 6-month public consultation that started with the deadlines set for September 2023. The next stages as well, in the 5th of April 2023, there was also an ECHA online information session for all stakeholders, just for them to prepare. We included the link just so people can review and also start acting on what they have to do. So adoption of restriction ultimately is expected or could be expected by 2025, within transitional period to be also discussed and established. Next slide, please. The justifications for the restriction is a EU-wide measure, so it's a manufacturer and importer uses within Europe. It helps to have a global growing volume for this substance group, so minimize that or completely substitute it and limit the emission of this, because obviously the wide toxicology status that these have. As far as remediation cleanup, it will be proven difficult and will be also very costly. As far as PFAS, because they move and they are forever chemical, is important to be able to contain them at the right time within the right infrastructure. And then as far as the EU internal market, they're trying to make a level of play field. So it will take time to establish a full, but restriction is under view. So we will see what the future will bring. But it's a EU-wide risk of a reduction measure. So there are costs that will be spread throughout those years. Let's have a look at the next slide. So PFAS can be divided into three main functional groups within this restriction proposal. The three main PFAS group are the PFAS and PFAA precursor, which provides the polyfluoroalkyls, which are obviously part of the everyday life, especially in the polymer industry. Then you have fluorinated gases, the second group, and the polymeric PFASs. The scope is very broad and includes polymer and fluorinated gases. The starting point is to have a full and clear definition of the substance, which includes all the chemicals that will then provide toxicity, ecotoxicity, and other type of concern related to this chemical. You can post this at any time, so you can view all the schemes. So I'll give you some time to do that on your own time. In the meantime, we can definitely go ahead on the next slide, please. So there are three main points for the focus of the proposal. So the first one was to identify the scope. Then there is a grouping approach, and then risk approach concern analysis as well. Finally, an analysis of alternatives. So if you go to next slide, we can see the chemical scope. So the concern of the scope is being defined by the OECD committee of 2021, where the definition was the starting points of finding what PFAS are, just to group them, because otherwise they can be chemicals of from 1,000 to 9,000. It's a very wide group. So all the substances that contain at least one CF2 group, metal group, or CFT group without any hydrogen, chlorine, bromine, or iodine attached to it. So that's very important. So the fluoropolymer are essentially fluorinated gases with some exemption, of course, as it always happens in science. There's always an exemption. Let's go on the next slide, where we look at the grouping approach. So there are two base properties of the PFAS. There is the chemical structure, which need to be important, especially when we're talking on polymers, and also the persistence risk. So this was acknowledged and studied by several groups, and what we're trying to do, the scientific industry, the scientific committee, is to avoid regrettable substitution when there are no suitable substitutes of the PFAS for a specific use. Prevention then is important for the future exposure of PFAS, which is not currently in use. It doesn't exist at all. Next slide, please. This highlights mainly the concern. The risks are based on the concern and what chemical group, what measure has been put in order to control those. So this is an important part of the process, and the time to lead and how long it will take into place. As far as risk concern, obviously PFAS has been highlighted in various different studies, but they are consistent. Mainly what can be done, find the threshold, a safe threshold, or what's the risk threshold, how emission can be controlled. So all concern that take up into adding the restriction proposal put forward. So the effectiveness of the restriction is based on the effectiveness of how the emission can be reduced or controlled per hours. So next slide, please. So alternatives are already adopted in some sector. The PFAS, as far as we've been seeing, there are forever chemical, but at the same time, there's also no suitable alternative in some cases. So it will require some time to find the suitable alternative that is as sufficient, as efficient, and the PFAS using that specific. Where they are used, industrial and feed products are heavily used, but also there are sectors such as the medical device sector, where research of alternative is still currently under development. And in this kind of case, it will definitely take time to find a suitable solution. So this concludes my slides and my section on PFAS introduction. So I can pass to Steve for the next section. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pietro. Okay, next slide, please, Freddy. So the restriction is a focus on the ban, manufacture, and use on placing on the market as substances on their own or as a constituent in a mixture or article greater than 25 parts per billion for any PFAS, 250 parts per billion for some of PFASs, or greater than 50 parts per million for PFASs. I'm not quite sure the distinction, but it's nonetheless, the point is substances on their own or as a constituent in a mixture or in an article. The restriction as a substance includes manufacture, use, and placing on the market on their own or in a substance, mixture, or article. I've just checked the restriction proposal this morning. Articles are about placing on the market, but not use in an article. So use of an article once it's placed on the market, once it has already been sold, is not covered within the restriction. Products placed on the market before entry into force of the restriction are not affected. Next slide, please. So we're now entering a thing called the public consultation. This is an information gathering exercise which goes into the final RAC and SEAC opinion forming, and therefore feeds into the Commission decision process. Next slide, please. The proposed restriction includes some derogations. So the restriction proposal basically says everything is banned 18 months after entry into force, unless there is a specific derogation covering that use. Some derogations are identified where there is a 6.5 year further delay beyond the 18 months. And there are furthermore, based on the availability of alternatives and necessity for society, which are 13.5 years beyond entry into force. And then finally, there are 5 cases where time unlimited derogations are foreseen. Now, all this is based on the information that they knew at the time of the restriction proposal being formed. And this is where the consultation exercise is really, really crucially important. And I'll be leading on to that next. Next slide, please. So the restriction identifies a range of possible derogations. The use of derogations are proposed to have associated obligations, such as annual reporting obligation to ECHA for manufacturers, importers, and formulators, and site-specific management plans to be established and reviewed annually by importers of downstream users of fluoropolymers and perfluoropolymers using any derogation, including information on the identity on the substance of the substances and the products they are used in, justification for the use, and details on the conditions of use and safe disposal. So even if you're covered by a derogation, there needs to be site-specific management plans and information reporting. This appears to impact importers of articles, including import of systems containing articles, as well as of substances and mixtures. So if I buy a significantly complex object from outside the EU into the EU, then I might have a reporting obligation for any fluoropolymers or other PFAS within those articles. Next slide, please. What is known? Well, we have a consultation input needed by the 25th of September. So the consultation is in process to help and shape the restriction proposal. So there is the opportunity to shape it. So including any required derogations and how long such derogations will last. That is based on evidence. Only where that evidence is sufficiently strong is a derogation proposed. Now, so that's sufficiently strong in the eyes of ECHA and their committees, of course. Where they do not feel there is good evidence, they do not propose any derogation at all. So where there is no derogation, it is an outright ban 18 months after entry into force. So sometime in 2026, 2027 at the earliest, but of that order. Therefore, potential derogations need strong evidence through the public consultation, which closes at the end of September. Next slide, please. The uses and applications that they know of are in a table that's in the restriction proposal, which I've taken a copy of here. The ones in green, they feel they have researched in detail. The ones in blue, they feel are researched in general. Orange, not researched in detail. And there may be a separate restriction proposal for the one purple use. Note the one in the bottom right-hand corner. Uses yet unknown. And we also have other niche applications on the table. This is where, if you're not covered by the green areas or where there is a good derogation proposed, this is where they need information from the consultation. The dossier further explains many gaps in understanding, whether it's analysis of alternatives, socio-economic impact, environmental fate, research and development program substitution, even for the researched in detail uses. It is not complete information, even for the green items. It is likely that the table does not represent all uses. I am absolutely sure of that. Many uses are highly general and multi-sector. So the moment you say things like electronics or lubricants, well, electronics and lubricants are all around us in many products all around your desk in front of you or in your car or anywhere. So it's unlikely to be comprehensive. Despite the 2,000 pages in the dossier, I've heard one NGO claim that it must be comprehensive because it is 2,000 pages. So never mind the quality, feel the width. I do not buy into this argument. Next slide, please. What information are ECHA expecting in the consultation responses is quite wide. For each in-scope substance, they want to know the sector and subsector of use, the use and sub-uses of how the chemical is used, the number of companies involved, the key functionalities of the substance, which obviously have to be replicated in any alternative, emissions to the environment in all life cycle stages, so manufacture, formulation, use, article use, recycling and disposal, and estimates and volumes and share by subsector and life cycle stage of those. They'd like to know availability, feasibility, hazards and risks of alternatives. Where none available, they want to know the R&D status, including financing, timescales and the success likelihood. Where none is available, they'd like to know the socio-economic consequences on customers, users, and other affected parties, obviously if there is a ban. And where available, the time where there is an alternative available, how long would it take, how much would it cost to take to substitute, and what is the impact on downstream users? So a formulator might choose to substitute but his customers may not like the alternative formulation. It may not suit their need. Essentially, the information requested is effectively, at least in outline terms, the same as a summary application for authorization for each of thousands of substances, all at once by the end of September. It is inevitable that they cannot get the same level of quality or detail as a full application for authorization. But essentially, they're asking for everything. They're asking for the moon. And this will have consequences when they get a deluge of information. Nonetheless, as stated previously, to defend your use, there has to be information provided in the public consultation, which is of good enough quality to demonstrate the point. Next slide, please. How will they use this data? So to develop Pietro's earlier point, a restriction is justified if there is an unacceptable risk to human health or the environment, to be addressed on a community-wide basis. Any such decision shall take into account the socio-economic impact of the restriction, including the availability of alternatives. Now, that's on a substance-by-substance basis. And obviously a use and availability of alternatives has to be assessed on a use or a customer need basis as well. So this is where we need to add to the information base to help them understand where there is a basis for a restriction and where there is not a basis for a restriction. The Risk Assessment Committee will formulate an opinion as to whether the suggested restrictions are appropriate in reducing the risk to health or the environment, taking into account comments in the consultation. The Socioeconomic Analysis Committee will formulate an opinion on the suggested restrictions based on the socio-economic impact, examining advantages and drawbacks of the proposed restrictions, also taking into account comments in the consultation. So, if the Article 68 requirements are met after receipt of opinions, the Commission will draft an amendment to Annex 17 of REACH and submit to the REACH Committee for decision. That's the member state input through comitology. Next. So, by substance, authorities need to demonstrate unacceptable risk and justify it is appropriate with the socioeconomic consequences and the availability of alternatives. For PFAS, the key is therefore data on emissions in manufacture, formulation, use in articles, recycling and disposal, because this is primarily an environmental concern. It has to have a clarity on the availability of alternatives and the consequences of a possible ban. So if there's no available alternative and the emissions or the environmental risk is low for a given substance, then there may be not a good case for restriction, and therefore there is a good case for derogation. So where the consequences are high and emissions controllable, derogation should be pursued. The length of any derogation will depend on the socioeconomic consequences and the research and development programs. It is in the authority's interest to derogate where there are high consequences and good control of the risk, because otherwise it undermines the case to restrict. The case to restrict is improved by taking out from the restriction scope, by derogating those uses where there is a high socioeconomic impact by banning. So yeah, we've seen this before on other substances in the past, that they will be happily take out uses and substances if it helps their overall case. Nonetheless, to abuse a principle of REACH, no data, no derogation. You get a ban if you don't help them understand your use. Next slide. You don't have all the information. No single company does. So no single company knows how many companies are affected. So sector organizations and surveys can help there. Uses by sector or subsector, well, formulators, suppliers of articles, their sub-tier suppliers, sector organizations through members, various sources of that information. Emissions by life cycle stage. Well, sector organizations reach out to product users, recyclers, disposal sites, as well as estimating or use volumes and emission controls. Availability of alternatives. Well, a formulator will only know the need of his users and customers through asking. So you have to reach down the supply chain. The R&D status, formulators, users, and end customers will have some contribution to that. Substitution plans, similarly, formulators, users, and their end customers in terms of when can I substitute, how can I substitute, what qualification steps do I have to go through? Is it possible to substitute at this time? And the economic consequences, well, every layer in the supply chain, manufacturers, formulators, customers, article manufacturers, system integrators, repair and maintenance organization, the customers, the end users, everyone may contribute to the economic consequences. Those who have been through the authorization process will know the value of reaching up and down the supply chain to add to your information, because supply chains are complicated and no one has all the data. If possible, do it through sector organizations where possible, because that's the only way to bring together your various resources. Next slide. Implications. Next slide. Many PFAS substances or their breakdown products have concerning attributes, whether it's persistence, bioaccumulation, mobility, and toxicity. I say many because not every PFAS substance is the same. We know that. So polymers in PTFE might be persistent, but not bioaccumulative, mobile, or particularly toxic. However, their breakdown products might have, and that's where the concern with fluoropolymers is. It is evident that many PFAS substances have been used too freely. They've been very convenient chemicals, whether it's fast food packaging or outdoor wear, whatever it is. And a lot of those uses have been without understanding on the consequences on the planet. So where use is not particularly essential for society, or where alternatives are clearly available, yeah, there is a case to restrict. Restrictions for such cases are clearly within the spirit and intent of REACH, which is trying to drive a balance between the need and environmental health and health cost. Where there is a need to do that, it does support the need for a restriction. So restrictions do need to be made with urgency, but there is likely obsolescence with unintended societal impact in many, many places. And that makes it hard. Next slide, please. So some quick conclusions, and then we'll go on to some wrap up and Q&A. Next slide. The restriction groups a wide range of substances as one restriction proposal. To quote the dossier, PFASs are considered as a group because all members of the group share a common hazard. I'm not sure I agree with that. It is very hard to say that every fluoropolymer, PFOA, F-gas, etc. shares the same hazard and risk profile. There's certainly an overlap of hazards between groups of PFASs, but making this supergroup has a danger of attributing hazards to substances that do not have them, treating all substances as equal without adequate evidence. This brings product obsolescence or loss of performance without clarity of thought or process. It is also likely to cause a regulatory block with a large, contentious and indigestible restriction with poor evidence. So the way to help better direct authority efforts for the good of the planet is to provide good information. In my view, it may be better to break up the PFAS supergroup into smaller and better substantiated interventions. Each the elephant in slices, if you like, not all at once. Next. Restriction is important for the health of the planet. The restriction dossier is too broad, ranging to reflect all uses fairly. The way to help best direct authority efforts is to provide good information, supporting differentiated approaches by subgroup, and supporting long-term derogations where justified by strong evidence. For this, they need information by the 25th of September. This is a monumental task, less than 6 months to do it, and that includes the summer holiday period, of course, and therefore time is of the essence. Fede, back to you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Pietro, also for your sections. So just wanted to touch base a bit quickly on our services related to PFAS. Of course, we help companies identify the impacts of the PFAS restriction proposal and where you can identify those, and also provide information and help with proving or derogation statements, and of course strategies related to PFAS. I think there's a lot to strategize. But then also, as Steve mentioned, very important to take part in the consultation, because based on that information, they will draw conclusions based on what to restrict and how. So therefore, we should really, and you should really take stake in that. And as Steve also mentioned, if you have an industry association working on that, then absolutely work through that, because there's simply too much information for everyone to work on it on their own. Nevertheless, we also, of course, provide support in preparing for this consultation and submitting all the related documents, and also for industry associations such as surveying members, the supply chain, and then of course consolidating and pulling all together and coordinating the contribution within this association and between different groups. But then also other services such as consultation, training, related legal services, and more. So we provide, I would say, a fairly large number of services covering most of the topics that can be, let's say, discussed about at this point in time. So please, if you have any questions, and of course, if you have want a quotation for such services, please feel free to reach us at sales@reachlaw.fi, or directly into contact with any of the speakers of this webinar and more. So now going to the Q&A, and I can see that we are receiving some questions also in the chat, but we received quite a lot of questions ahead of the webinar as part of the registration process. So we'll go through those now first, and we have about 10 minutes or so, but we can go a bit over time. So I'm very impressed with my colleagues going through so many slides in such a rapid succession. So a lot of slides per minute there for you to digest. But as Pietro, I think, mentioned, and I mentioned in the beginning, please do feel free to look at the recording later on, which you can pause at your discretion to read through the slides and figures in your own time. Okay, so heading over to the questions, we have three pages more or less of pre-submitted questions. Some are maybe a bit repetitive. I will nonetheless go through them one by one, more or less, and my colleagues are then will provide the answer, or just say that this was already covered here and there. So start with the first one. Thresholds are set in the regulations, but what are the test methods thereof? So Steve, do you want to take this?
I think this is a tough question, because I'm not sure anyone really knows. I think the enforcement side of ECHA and the member states are basically thinking of using the presence of fluorine as an indication for further questions. That's not very helpful, because that means my toothpaste is in trouble until they ask me whether whether that fluorine is there as a result of PFAS. So this is such a wide range of chemicals, it is very hard to see how they can reasonably test at a detailed enough level to identify the substance and its concentration. I think that's one of the reasons why their combination of PFAS being less than 250 parts per billion, the combination there is because they're not sure which one's which. It's very hard to tell. So I'm not sure I can answer that question beyond that. The presence of fluorine is an indicator. After that, and I don't know.
Thank you, Steve. So the next one, this was touched upon in the presentation, of course, but nonetheless, repetition is the mother of all learnings, more or less. So the question is it necessary to regulate even those that are not highly toxic? So those PFASs.
Right, okay. There are a range of hazards here. Yes, some PFAS are toxic. Drinking water in the film dark waters is a good example. However, a combination of persistence bioaccumulation, persistence mobility are also considered to be of concern, and especially the ability for PFAS to go around the world in the environment. So the hazards vary. And yes, they are taking a group approach for a wide range of things with different hazards. So it's not just about those that are highly toxic.
Thank you, Steve. So the next question, could it, so the PFAS restriction, I assume, control prohibit the use of PTFE plastic objects, for example, mixing paddles and pipe work, or these plastic particles included in a chemical mixture?
If it's in a mixture, then it's clearly placing on the market or use as a mixture would be restricted. Regarding plastic objects, these are articles, so this would restrict their placing on the market, but not their subsequent use. So if it has already been bought, fine, but you can't buy spares. So it does affect the supply of plastic objects, PTFE plastic objects, both at the import stage and the manufacture stage in Europe, and also the provision of spare parts.
Thank you. And question number 4. So this was already, I guess, covered in a bit, but let's reiterate. So how can manufacturers identify PFAS in their components, as the REACH restriction proposal uses a chemical structure to determine the scope? Our suppliers won't understand such a definition either. Furthermore, it's not feasible to send lists of 10,000 plus PFASs.
I agree with the question. Absolutely. The best we can do is ask the supplier. Don't forget to ask the supplier about the substances they use, not just what they put in the products. Because if they use a PFAS as a process chemical or aid, then that can cause obsolescence just as surely as if it's in the product. But it's only through inquiry and education that we're going to get close. And this is one of the reasons why I think many industries are really, really concerned about this massive group approach.
Yes, yes. And the last one actually is just a comment, so we can skip that. So the next question, this would be 6, number 6. Will an FMD be sufficient to meet these requirements?
A full material disclosure or declaration may help you understand whether you are exposed, but having a full material disclosure is not the same thing as compliant with the restriction. It may tell you where you've got action to take.
Then a question also, how are these companies, maybe a more general question based on our experience, so how are the companies most affected responding to this? So for example, producers of PTFE and so forth.
I'm not going to name any. The ones I know of are looking very hard at their downstream market and trying to interpret the so-called essential use criterion to understand which uses might be defendable going forward. So which market segments they might stay in and which ones they might not stay in. I imagine some companies may be trying to exit these chemicals entirely, which may give rise to obsolescence risk. But this is speculation. The best way to go is ask the relevant associations or companies.
Yes, absolutely. And then I think this touches a bit on UK. So the question is, can we expect to see other regions in the world following the EU restriction proposal? So maybe you can touch on what they're thinking about in the UK, more pragmatic approach, that is.
Well, first of all, if I go back to the global level first, the so-called strategic approach to international chemicals management, or the UN Environment Programme, have been long looking at PFAS as a concern, and we see in various places around the world, including in Canada and various US states, that there's PFAS restrictions going on all over the place. In the UK, they are looking at a group restriction approach there as well, Fortunately, they are taking a bit more of a pragmatic approach and not necessarily including fluoropolymers. But that's still in review, and that's not the final answer.
Okay, good. Thank you. And then a question on the proposed restriction. So will it be applied to manufacturing machinery already in use, for example, Teflon coated machinery? You answered this already, but please.
Not the use, but availability of spare parts would be affected unless derogated, yes.
Yes. And this is, I think, more of a comment, but if we have anything to add, then please, Steve or Pietro do so. So a comment like the major polymer manufacturers, FKM, we know that the regulatory restrictions are only justified for PFAS processing aids, but are not justified for FKM polymers. We therefore support the general idea of removing fluoropolymers from the restriction. So
unfortunately, they are within the scope of the restriction, and many stakeholder groups do support their inclusion, and any removal of fluoropolymers is not yet a done deal.
Yeah, I totally agree with Steve, and obviously this is part of the analysis of alternatives part of the restriction that will have to be looked at into.
Yeah.
So in summary, assume you are affected and respond accordingly.
Exactly. Okay, so a few questions on IVD. So the first one is, so is this research use only in vitro diagnostics to be placed on the market also exempted under the R&D category?
Ask a lawyer, but my view of scientific R&D under the relevant articles of the restriction process, scientific R&D of chemicals does not really cover use of those chemicals, even if those uses are in a lab environment. So my presumption is they do not get exempted, but ask a lawyer.
Yeah, and a follow up on that. So is IVD for commercial purposes also exempted under the category of research and development?
No, not as far as I can tell.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so last page before we take some from the live feed. So the question is: we are using in our plant several parts made of fluoropolymers. Assuming that these parts do not fall under any derogation, must those be replaced either at the end of the transition period after the entry into force or at the end of their life? Question.
I want to be careful about what do we mean by the end of the life. Is that the end of the production life or the end of the life of the article, etc.? Production, if there is no derogation, then production would have to stop at the end of the relevant transition period, but use of the products already sold can carry on. Obviously, that would affect spare parts. They don't have to be removed from the use environment, but they cannot be replaced or refurbished or whatever. That's the difficulty.
Okay, thank you. And actually, there's some sort of a spelling error in question 14, which I didn't spot earlier. So if anyone understands what they're questioning or commenting, then please reply. If not, then I'll just go to the last one.
Well, I think Freddy, the questioner was asking whether we can where PFAS can be found in electrical or electronic products, and we don't really know. Ask the manufacturers.
Yeah, good point. Okay, last one. As a hardware distributor, the chemical composition of hardware does not flow through the supply chain. Yeah, we know that. How do PFAS restrictions apply to distributor without access to chemical composition data?
You are required to comply. You cannot place products on the market if they contain articles containing PFAS, even if you don't know that. That's what the restriction essentially would say. So you would have to find out through your contracts or your suppliers to make sure that they are being compliant with the restriction.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so now let's take a few questions, just a few questions from the live feed. So I'll take some which I know clearly have not been answered or maybe can add some additional value. So about enforcement, what about the enforcement when the regulation enters into force? Will there be audits, or how will this be enforced? A good question, I think.
Will there be audits? Yes. Will the auditors know what to look for, or what they're doing? Possibly not at first. They may get better with advice and sharing of ideas in the forum over time. But there should always be assumed to be in, audits. Different countries take different approaches, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Then another question, and actually I'll just take two more, and then we'll end for today. So almost keeping to our time, which is unusual, I would say, especially webinars where I'm participating. Okay, so question is how to deal with surveys you get from customers if you don't know where PFAS might be a part of the raw materials you purchase. So this touch upon the same question in different formats that we covered. But Steve, if you want to elaborate, then please do so.
Having been in industry, receiving surveys from customers saying where are these substances, you cannot give a positive, no, I don't have those substances. You end up having to say, to the best of my knowledge, this is what I know. It's always going to be, how do you manage the grey of potential non-compliance and trying to keep your company lawyers on side. It's just a tough situation. I understand where the question is coming from, but you have to do the best you can and try not to give a definitive answer if you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point there. Okay, and the last question for today. So to break the PFAS supergroup into more feasible subgroups, is providing information under the consultation stage the only way? Question mark, and then it continues. Can't we expect ECHA itself will direct more detailed research on this before the restriction is put in force?
Many stakeholders think they've done a really, really thorough job because they've got lots of information. That's not the same thing as having enough information or clear information. They are using the consultation to improve on the stuff they've already done. I do not expect them to do further research programs before going forward. If the questioner is hoping that responding to the consultation is not necessary because something else will bring them to, let's say, a stage of reality first, I think this is the process by which they face reality. They need to be overwhelmed by good, clear information saying they've got a bigger problem than what they thought. That will help wake them up.
That's a good point. Who knows, maybe AI will help or not. We'll see. Okay, so that actually concludes our webinar today. So thank you very much for your attention, and also thank you to my colleagues Steve and Pietro for providing the bulk of the presentation. And please feel free to reach out to us for questions, comments, and of course if you need our services to help you guide you through these PFAS difficulties, to say the least. Here you see the contact details, and of course I wish you a very nice day and stay tuned for upcoming REACH Law webinars. And also if you want to attend, as mentioned, our symposium in October, please do reach out to us at marketing@reachlaw.fi or to any of the persons you see on the screen here now with their contact details. So thank you very, very much, and I wish you a very nice day. Bye-bye.